In Moldova, it was really interesting. I was able to speak to the men often, sometimes only hours after they crossed the border. So I discovered that there are some very particular emotions attached to that moment for many of them, which was a relief.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello and welcome to the Transformative Podcast with me, Irena Remestwenski. Today we're joined by Dr. Sofie Rose, a political scientist and postdoctoral fellow in international politics from the Center for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. We will be talking today about her recently finished project titled The Politics of Masculinity and Stigmatization of Fighting-Age Ukrainian Men Who Flee the War. Sofie recently spent over a year as visiting research fellow at the University of Vienna and was also associated researcher with us at RECET from March 2024 to May 2025. Sofie, it is my pleasure to be your host again and to welcome you at RECET one more time.
Thank you so much, Irena. I'm very happy for this invitation.
Sofie, your work sheds light on a rarely discussed byproduct of the war in Ukraine, the experiences of men who have fled conscription. Could you briefly tell us what first drew you to this topic and how your fieldwork shaped your understanding of the realities of these men?
Yes, absolutely. I started this project back in 2023, but I have been interested in it actually since the beginning of the full-scale war, where the travel ban was initiated in Ukraine. Actually, it started a little bit randomly. I was stranded in an airport in Dublin, and I accidentally sat next to a Ukrainian couple. This was after the full-scale war had started. And my first thought was, how did he get out of the country? Because I know there is a travel ban right now. And then this just accelerated a whole pool of questions in my head. It's like, how are Ukrainian society perceiving those men who flee? How is he perceiving himself? Is this difficult for him that he chose to leave Ukraine? Have he already been abroad for a long time, maybe? So many questions came up, and I decided to start researching a bit and see if there are some information on this. And at that point, it turned out that there was not so much about it. There was one article from the New York Times that was trying to interview and cover a bit some of the voices from men who chose not to fight and left Ukraine despite the travel ban. So that was kind of how it started, that I wanted to construct a project application to actually study this in depth. And I did, and I got the funding from the Independent Research Fund Denmark to conduct a 2-year research project on this topic.
In the article, The Right Not to Fight, Protection of Ukrainian Men Who Flee the Full-Scale War, you describe how certain public campaigns and media narratives in Ukraine portray men who avoid the draft as cowards. What does this tell us about Ukrainian ideas of masculinity? And also, how do these narratives affect how men see themselves, especially in the times of war?
So the project tries to cover like different levels of this. Now I already said, right, that it's in the title, it says stigmatization of Ukrainian men who choose not to fight. Of course, this was also a question mark already in the beginning. So are they stigmatized or not? And if they are stigmatized, by whom are they stigmatized? How much are they stigmatized? So I both looked at this from the state level. So I wanted to see how is the state portraying men who choose not to fight and who flee the war. And I also looked at it from a societal perspective. But if we should try to first cover a bit the state perspective and just to address your question. So there are many different ways that we can try to, look at this issue. What I chose to do was to look at official statements from Ukrainian authorities. So in particular, of course, ruling party, but also other politicians. And then I also looked at recruitment campaigns coming out from the Ukrainian armed forces to see what kind of image is portrayed here. And what is said about those who do not comply to this image of masculinity. And what I found was that it's very quickly turning into a quite stereotypical understanding of what a warrior is, who a warrior is supposed to be. And mostly this is the symbolic and the physical imprint of it. We can see a man. So mostly it's a man, first of all, when we look at the recruitment campaigns, for example, if we take those first. And it's also a particular man. It's a man who is mostly expressing a very stoic and brave self-understanding, but of course also a strong man, a big man, often a tall man, also often a man with a beard, which is quite interesting. And my point was that when we look at those campaigns, we can see how the duty to fight is constructed. And this is constructed, of course, for a reason to make men agree to join the military, and also to make this a heroic act, which I will say personally think it is in this situation. But in the same movement, there will also be made a hierarchy, is my understanding of this. So those men who fight and who comply with these stereotypes of what it means to be a fighter, they are, of course, at the top of the hierarchy. And then when we go further down this ladder, we can see some of the men who, for example, chose not to fight and who do not comply to this image. This is just one part of it, because of course in itself this is not creating a very strong stigmatization against those men who choose not to fight. But when we combine it with some of the official statements that we see coming out from the politicians, from Zelensky, but also other politicians in Ukraine, we can see that there is quite a stigmatizing discourse about it. For example, Zelensky had this infamous sentence in his New Year's address in 2023, where he said that every citizen now must choose what they want to be, a winner or a refugee, where this was set up as if you cannot be a winner if you choose to flee. And when we dive a little bit more into the discourse on this, we can see that this is particularly addressed towards men, although women, of course, also described to me in the fieldwork that I did that they also feel shame for leaving. I will say that the masculinity ideal that's coming from the state narrative is getting more and more narrow, in the sense that there are less space for men to perform other forms of masculinity than the militarized form of masculinity, which we often see particularly in full-scale war.
You mentioned in the article that the men you interviewed expressed a wide range of emotions, from shame to guilt to anger to defiance. What does this emotional complexity reveal about the moral and social pressures that men face when making such a deeply personal decision to flee?
I did in total 59 interviews with Ukrainian men who fled over the border, most of them illegally, but I also did interviews with some who did it legally, either because they were able to do it right before the full-scale invasion started. Some of them were on vacation, for example, or some had been living abroad for some time already. But the vast majority that I have interviewed for this study fled illegally, particularly into Moldova, where I went several times to do fieldwork, because in Moldova, it was really interesting. I was able to speak to the men often right after they crossed the border, sometimes only hours after they crossed the border. So I discovered, as I did this a couple of times, I discovered that there are some very particular emotions attached to that moment for many of them, which was a bit unexpected for me. And that is relief, right? So many felt huge relief because they actually managed to do this. And for most, it was a quite difficult journey. Some have planned it for a long time, of course, to try to get over the border and not get caught by the border guards. So many expressed this relief. But then when I talked to either the same person later, sometimes I did follow-up interviews, and other times I did interviews with men who have been abroad for a little bit longer, then the emotions started to be more complex often, and more men described that having doubts about if this was the right choice that they made for themselves. But also some of them described a feeling of shame. And I will say that I believe that from the research that I did, that there's to some extent a class dimension to this feeling of guilt and shame. More men, for example, from working class backgrounds who I interviewed in southern Moldova in particular, who have fled illegally and who have really felt that they have been pushed by the state, that they have been under a lot of pressure, that they were not anymore able to do their job in Ukraine because they couldn't go to work. They would be mobilized if they left the house. they felt a lot of anger instead. And for that reason, they also described feeling less guilt. Whereas those men I interviewed, for example, in Denmark and Austria, where I have also interviewed a lot of men who fled, they often came from more highly educated backgrounds, worked in white-collar professions, and have had more possibilities after they fled to go to countries where they could still pursue the career that they had originally been doing in Ukraine, for example. And they often described feeling more guilt, actually. But I will say also that there is a temporal aspect to this. A lot of those people I talked to, it was in 2023 and the beginning of 2024, whereas those interviews I describe of the working class men was done later in 2024, after the new mobilization law, for example, and after mobilization intensified. So I just want to say that I think this is also having, an effect on how the emotions changes. Emotions are complex. That's what we can say for sure.
You also draw interesting parallels between today's shaming of the draft evaders and historical practices like the white feather movement in the World War I. What do these continuities tell us about the enduring links between masculinity, citizenship, and the expectation to fight?
I'm drawing on a bit on historic cases as well, because this is, of course, not first time we see in history that there is a very large pressure from the state on men during wartime to perform military masculinity and to sign up voluntarily to the army. So we have this example that you already mentioned, right? The white feather movement that was in the UK during World War I, where women would put a white feather in the waistcoat of men who did not appear in uniform in public, for example. Sometimes this could even be because he was a veteran who returned, or he could also have a legitimate, reason not to fight. But this movement became known, of course, as the white feather movement because of this practice, and it was meant to publicly shame men. What's interesting, I think, about that movement is that we don't see anything like that in Ukraine, first of all, at the moment. But it's often talked about the white feather movement as if, this was something that women did to men, but it was initiated by conservative politicians in the UK. So again, this is how we can see that it often comes actually from the state level, because it is the state that needs to persuade men to go into the armed forces and perform military masculinity. That's the parallel that I want to draw to Ukraine, is that the stigmatization and the pressure is something that I can definitely see coming most from state level and official level, and then it gradually becomes less as you go down. So for example, the societal pressure is less, I will say. I did another article on societal perceptions of men who don't want to fight. Here I did 35 interviews with Ukrainian citizens, both based in Ukraine still and some who fled the country themselves. What we could see in these interviews is that there is not just a direct stigmatization. So it's not like you can say that, the whole of Ukrainian society is stigmatizing men who don't want to fight. That's absolutely not what I see in the research that I do. In fact, I see a lot of understanding towards men who don't want to fight. And this is particularly also, I think, stemming from that most people know a person who evaded the draft, and most people also know a person who is fighting. So there is a lot of sympathy in some way for both sides, because there are so many, lived experiences at play here. I think it's important to state that Ukrainian society, when it comes to stigma and those who don't want to fight, is a very, very complex thing and not straightforward at all.
Your article speaks of, I quote you, dual precarity. Men who flee are seen both as refugees and as draft evaders. Could you elaborate a little bit on the specific vulnerabilities that these men face once abroad, and how this dual status shapes their sense of belonging or exclusion?
I introduces this idea that there is a dual precarity for Ukrainian men in particular right now who chose not to fight. And we do have quite a lot of research showing that refugee status for men has been a contested phenomenon for a long time. So when we think about a refugee, we don't classically think about an adult man, a capable, able-bodied adult man. We often think about women, children, and elderly persons. We can even see this in some of the rhetoric from the EU leaders. For example, the Polish foreign minister, he was calling on quite recently to end social benefits for Ukrainian adult men abroad, or who were in Poland, of course. And he said something like, now I quote from the best of my memory, that it's not a human right to receive benefits to avoid the draft and not defend your country. I think this is really showing how civilian men, even though they are civilian, they're not drafted yet. They are civilian status, which is a particular status in international law, right? Even though they have this status, they are still not perceived as refugees who have the same rights as other refugees. That's the one thing about being a refugee, which is a quite marginalized male identity to possess. And then there is, of course, the other thing that most Ukrainian men who flee abroad, they are automatically perceived as potential draft evaders, or even, I often hear also in media that they are talked about as being deserters, although, of course, to be a deserter, you have to have been mobilized first. This is also, I think, where we can see in the rhetoric about how people speak about men from Ukraine abroad is already shaped by a discourse of that they are potential combatants, they are seen as potential soldiers, and this is what they ought to do, basically. Of course, this is giving some particular emotional vulnerabilities, but also vulnerabilities in general in terms of obtaining the same rights as other refugees. We do have some data coming out showing the beginning of the invasion in particular that it was more difficult for some men to receive IDP assistance within Ukraine. So for internally displaced persons, this could be a problem. I have not seen any evidence that it has been more difficult for men, though, to obtain some of the rights of the same refugee status, for example, as women in other EU countries. But as I already exemplified, the rhetoric is already there, and that is creating a certain pressure.
Your research touches on a deeply sensitive issue in Ukraine, and it's challenging the dominant wartime narratives and gender norms. I really wonder how your work has been received by Ukrainian audiences, in academia, the media, among the public. Have you faced criticism or misunderstanding, or perhaps found allies who share your view that this conversation is very necessary?
This was obviously also something that I have been, honestly quite nervous about when I started this project. How would it be received? Would it anger people? Also, me being an outsider, I'm not a Ukrainian myself. Would I be seen as a legitimate person to conduct this kind of research? And I think those questions should be asked, right? It's right to ask those questions. But luckily, I will say that mostly I have received positive feedback on this project from Ukrainians. Of course, especially when I talk to the men I interview, often I am the first person that they share their emotions with. Many talk about that it's shameful to even discuss it with others, particularly those who are still in Ukraine, because they don't feel that they have the right to complain about anything. They don't have a right to suffer, or they don't have a right to feel under pressure or have difficult emotions because they are no longer in danger, because they are no longer in Ukraine. And then there is people that I meet, for example, Ukrainian scholars at conferences. Many have reached out and have said that it really resonates with some of their personal experiences. And of course, that's very nice for me to know that this is something that people like me to do. Some have said explicitly that they think that it's better that an outsider is doing it than Ukrainians are doing it, because I am more emotionally distanced from the conflict, because it's not my relatives who live in Ukraine, it's not my relatives who fight. And therefore, some people find it more comfortable to speak openly to me, as there are less fear of judgment. But at the same time, of course, I have also met some people who said that this is not the right time to ask these questions. We're in the middle of a war, and Russia is already using these narratives, exploiting them for propaganda, which is true. Also, Russia is really using narratives on mobilization and the challenging mobilization effort that Ukraine is in at the moment, spinning them out of proportion, making up stories that are either not true or accelerated tremendously. I myself is of that understanding that as academics, it's our duty to ask also the difficult questions, also in the difficult times, because this is a very effective way also of combating misinformation and propaganda, to only bring out what we can actually say for certain.
Finally, you write that militarized gender norms could have long-term effects on post-war Ukrainian society. Looking into the future, what kinds of policy changes in Ukraine or also within the EU could, in your opinion, be made now to better address the protection needs of men who refuse to fight? And also, what would a more inclusive post-war vision of masculinity look like, in your view, and how can Ukraine achieve it?
I believe that often we see that, right, after both during conflict and after armed conflict, especially of such a large scale as the one going on in Ukraine right now, that gender norms is changing quite tremendously, often becoming more narrow, more traditional. But what is interesting when we look at Ukraine, and that's of course also something we have seen in other conflict, is that there are different movements at the same time, because the gender norms for women, for example, is to some extent expanding, I will say, because women are getting access to more roles, both in the military, roles they never were allowed to possess before World War II at least, also starting to take up a lot of jobs that were normally mostly reserved for men. Many women are also alone now, either abroad or inside the country, and that is of course also creating new norms and sometimes more empowerment, of course also more difficulties. But when we look at the masculinity norms and the male roles, I will say that mostly this is becoming more narrow. And in that sense, there are also often a little bit less access to perform, for example, caring masculinity and what I call masculine care work, which is, of course, a normal part of most men's life, to care for their children, for their parents, their partners. There are limited space for that when you are expected to first and foremost go to the front, right? And this is not something that we can just turn on and turn off again. So, of course, it will have effects also whenever a peace deal is reached or a ceasefire is implemented. So, for Ukraine in the future, this is something that I think we should really look at. I think one place where we could, especially when we talk about the men who fled abroad and how to welcome them back in terms of reintegration, there is the new Ministry of Unity, or sometimes it has also been called the Ministry of Return, because this is one of the main tasks, right? How can we make sure that Ukraine remains social coherent also after conflict? And I think it's most important that, of course, it stems from Ukraine and Ukrainians themselves to dictate like what is the best way to welcome back our citizens. But if men know that they'll be prosecuted when they return, if veterans is not cared for sufficiently, because that can make conflicts between those who return and those who fought. If these issues are not cared for, then it will be problematic for men to return who did not fight. So I think some active campaigns actually also would be something that could be really worked on from Ukraine's side. And for the EU, like this is just my personal opinion, I think that of course the EU should just keep their doors open to Ukrainians as long as they need to stay in safety.
Well, I have no further questions. Thank you, Sofie. This was wonderful. Thank you for giving me such a nuanced view on such a sensitive topic. It was great to have you on the podcast. Thank you.